You know, when I was thinking and preparing for this class, it dawned on me that maybe we should have entitled it Riding the Reformation. Riding that Reformation. Because the Reformation really is not an event sometime in the past. It's a process that's happening right now. And it's going to continue. I mean, you don't have to look very far to see all of the controversy involving our religious faith vis-a-vis other folks. So I think of it, I guess, as very dynamic. And in all honesty, it's been a rough ride. And we picked up on that a little bit last week, and I'm going to give you a little bit more of that this week. In a way of kind of thanking you for coming back, I've saved the best till last, which is to say I've saved the most provocative, the most, I'm going to call it thoughtful. I can't prove any of this. I'm just picking up on what I've stumbled across to share with you. I'm not making this up, but it is hopefully a new way of thinking, maybe add a little bit of perspective. Last week, you'll remember, we got out a map to plot locations associated with the Reformation. Major locations associated in Europe, a map of Europe, with the Reformation. That's what all those little red flags are. And we said, well, you know, as we look at that, do we see any kind of pattern to those locations, or is it just a random distribution? I mean, it could be just pure chance. If it's not pure chance, then the question is, well, does it tell us anything about the Reformation geographically? Maybe in some other way. But at the very minimum, can we learn anything about the Reformation geographically?
Would you say the green flags were?
The green, let me walk over here so I'll be sure I'm giving you good information. There's only one green.
There's one down there.
Oh, I'm sorry, Rome. This is Rome. So you get the relationship between Rome and the rest of the map. And this green I'm going to tell you about in a minute. As usual, you're ahead of me, Mary.
The suspense builds.
So the question is, okay, if there's a pattern, what does it mean? Well, as we looked at it, we said, you know, well, there is kind of a pattern here. First of all, with the one exception here, which actually turned out to be irrelevant to our discussion, all of the red flags are north of the Alps mountain range. And most of them also are east of the Rhine River. So we do kind of have a cluster in Northern Europe. And in fact, there's a few more in the Netherlands and England. And we know that when Protestantism spreads, it spreads to the north, into all of Scandinavia. So we have a phenomenon, seemingly, a Northern European phenomenon here. The question is, does that tell us very much? Well, we said there is a clue, but it's a clue in a very strange place. In a story about Sherlock Holmes. The curious incident of the dog in the night. You remember why it was curious?
Because the dog didn't bark.
Because the dog didn't bark. Sherlock picked up not on what the dog did, but what the dog did not do. So I want to throw that out to you. Can we start to think about the Reformation in a very different way, not about something that happened, but about something that did not happen? Can we argue from silence, so to speak? Now, what in the world am I talking about here? Okay, I'm going to walk you through this. It's complicated, but you'll see why it's so intriguing. At least I found it very intriguing when I stumbled across it, and why I want to share with you. Okay, you all know, or you'll remember from your history, when Julius Caesar was assassinated in 44 BC, there was, not surprisingly, an enormous power struggle for control of his empire. And the struggle was between two people, his stepson, Octavian, or Octavius, it's spelled both ways, and one of his generals, Mark Antony. You know what happened. Octavian wins. He goes into battle with Mark Antony and he defeats him, and thereby becomes sole leader of the Roman Empire, or inheritor of the Roman Empire. This happens, and then let me give you a date. That assassination, 44 BC. Octavian seizes control in 27 BC. Lots of dates to remember. And in the process, he changes his name to Augustus. That's where we get Augustus. Historians look back and say he was really the first Roman emperor. He didn't call himself that, but effectively that's what happened. The chain of emperors begins with Augustus. And of course, there's how many statues of Augustus? He became a long-reigning emperor, and by virtue of being the first, all the textbooks, of course, mention him. Now, why am I bringing this up? One of the things emperors do is not only protect their power, they expand it, or at least they try to expand it. And one of the most obvious ways to expand your power, if you happen to be emperor of the Roman Empire, is to enlarge the empire, to conquer more territory, to bring more territory under your control. So what, I'm assuming now, what Augustus did, he got out a map. Let's try this ourselves. Here's a map of Europe. You can see in the red, that's the Roman Empire. It completely surrounds the Mediterranean Sea. So it's quite remarkable, just in and of itself. And remember, this is late 1st century BC. Okay, to the east, you know what's to the east, the Middle East. You know how chaotic that is politically. So that's not a very attractive target for Augustus. But look to the north. You'll see way over in the upper right corner, there's kind of a blank area. I'm not sure how to pronounce that, Samardia or Samartia? Anyway, these are Middle Eastern people who migrated to the north. Not very attractive to the Romans, hostile to the Romans. However, they have created an alliance, or some alliances, with the green area, which is not a country at all. We have to be very careful here. It's not a country at all. It's a network of tribes, Germanic tribes. The Romans call that whole green Germania, or Germania. We get out of that German, right? Germania. They just give that name to it, the Great Germania, of this unconquered, barbarian, practically a wilderness. But that becomes very attractive to Augustus. And so he sets out to conquer it and bring it into the empire, because you can see geographically what it's going to do. It's going to take his empire all the way to the water in the north. So that's his plan. Now, he starts doing this in 16 BC. And he sends the generals up to the north with lots of troops and lots of supplies and so forth. And they establish themselves right along the Rhine River. I won't do this exactly, but you know, you can see where it is. That's his base of operations, is the Rhine. And then he's going to move inland in various campaigns. The first man he sends, a man named Drusus, D-R-U-S-U-S, Drusus, unfortunately falls off his horse and dies as a result of the accident. So Augustus has to find somebody else, and that somebody else turns out to be one of his own adopted sons, a man named Tiberius. You've heard of Tiberius. He turns out to be extremely important to you and me as Christians, because as it happens, and this is all going to be in the future for Augustus, Tiberius is going to become the next Roman emperor in 14 AD. And that's the emperor that Jesus will grow up with as an adult. When Jesus talks about the Roman emperor, he's really talking about Tiberius. He would have known about Augustus, but as far as contemporary, it would be Tiberius. But that's all in the future. But I just want to give you that little heads up. Now, why am I mentioning Tiberius other than what the Romans decide to do as part of this campaign of aggression in the Germanic lands? They say, well, you know, let's recruit some of those tribesmen, those wild and woolly Germanic young males, bring them into the Roman Empire, make them Roman citizens, train them in the Roman army, and use them against their own people, because let's face it, they know the territory. They can speak all these strange languages. Great strategy. So Tiberius tries this, recruits. Now I say recruit, I don't know how volunteer, many of these guys volunteered. Doesn't matter, the point is, we're only interested in this because of one man. One of the people that he gets a hold of is a young man whose name we don't know. There's no record of what his real name was. We do know the Roman name, and that was Arminius. Arminius is the Latin name that was given to this fellow. He was fairly high up in his own tribe. Let me go back. If you see the word right in the middle of the green, you see the word magna. And if you look immediately to the left, you'll see a little name, the Cherusi. That's the name of Arminius' tribe. He was a chieftain in the Cherusi tribe. So he had some status among his own people. So he was doubly valuable to the Romans because he had the respect of his own tribe. So he was very knowledgeable about his own people and the whole area, that whole green area. Okay. Arminius becomes very valuable because he turns out to be a good Roman soldier. I have just picked this picture here for you. Nobody knows what Arminius looks like. We don't know his name, we don't know what he looked like. This is just an artistic attempt to say, well, you put some Roman equipment on him and maybe he looked like this. That's fair, you know, just for our purposes today. Okay, what happens next? The story is complicated. Tiberius is recalled by Augustus because there's something else going on that's even more problematic than these darn Germanic tribes. So Tiberius is called away, and another man is sent in to take his place. This happens now we're fast forwarding here, this happens in 6 AD. 6 AD. And this time, the man is named Varus, V-A-R-U-S. Look at his name. Don't you love these Latin names? Publius Tiberius Varus. He takes with him on his campaign 5 legions of troops, plus all of the additional people that have to go along with that. You've got supply wagons, you've got mules, you've got even families. Some families are taken along. The scouting parties as a whole. I'm not an expert on the Roman army by any means, but you can get the idea. We're talking about a lot of people. A legion typically, not always, had 6,000 men in it. So 5 legions is potentially 30,000 people. The records we have of all of this are not clear. So we can't be absolutely sure if Varus was fully staffed with his people. Doesn't matter. We're talking about a lot of troops and a lot of other people that were involved in this massive campaign against the Germanic tribes. One of the people he took along with him was Arminius. He needed the knowledge of Arminius for his campaign. And that's going to turn out to be utterly, well, history-making. Here's what happens. we're going to fast forward to 9 AD. 3 years have passed. Varus is having success with subduing the Germanic tribes. In fact, he's building on what little success had already occurred under the other generals, but he's having a lot of success. Bringing them into the fold, establishing relationships with them, pacifying them, da-da-da-da. So in 9 AD, he spends the entire year negotiating treaties, deals, relationships, alliances, whatever. So it's a relatively peaceful year. But given the, as you can imagine, you have to retire from the field when the weather starts to get cold. So and you've got a long trek to get wherever you are to get back to the Rhine River to quarter for the winter. So by the end of August, he's ready to stop and take all of his troops back to the Rhine River. What happens then is really weird. He gets word from somebody within the tribes that Arminius is actually a double agent. That Arminius is not going to betray his own people. That he is actually plotting to set a trap for the Roman army. Now Varus has actually taken only 3 of his 5 legions on this tour in the summer of 9 AD. So he's got 2 legions back at the river, 3 with him. That's still a lot of people. That's 6,000 max. That's potentially 18,000 plus others. Let's say 15,000. It doesn't matter. He's got a lot of troops. And they're in unfamiliar territory. This is not like the Romans like to do business. But Varus says, this is ridiculous. I know Arminius. He's done well in the Roman army. He's a person that I need. So Varus said, forget it. It can't be true. It's intelligence coming from a faulty source. It was totally correct. Arminius was not going to hurt his own people. He had colluded with several of his kinsmen back in the Tarusi tribe to set this trap for the Romans. And it was ingenious, utterly ingenious, and you're going to see why. Now, I don't want to take all day telling this story. It's very complicated. We call it the Battle of Teutoburg Forest, because Northern Europe, those of you who've been to Germany, you know, is heavily forested. Beautiful place, but heavily forested and not easily negotiated by large numbers of troops. Here's what happened. The red line is the path that the Romans were forced to take. The Romans loved to spread out horizontally. They couldn't do it given the terrain in Teutoburg Forest. They had to narrow down to columns of maybe 5 across, 6 across, not like they like to do it. So they are now squeezed in, and if you look in the upper right, it's blue. That's a big swampy area. You cannot get through there. And if you look at the lower right, it's brown. That's mountainous, hilly. You can't pass through there. All you can do is squeeze through that little green area between the swamp and the hill. It was the perfect location for an ambush. And that's exactly what Arminius did. He had troops hiding on both sides, on the swamp side and on the hillside. And when the Romans come in, strung out in this long queue, probably a mile or more long, with their supply wagons and everything, once they get in there, from both sides they are attacked. And it was a utter slaughter. Utter slaughter. Horrible, horrific. This is an artist's attempt to give you some idea what it must have been like. Here are the Germans in the lower, here in the foreground are the German tribes just waiting to pounce. They're also across this little gully, this little pathway in the trees over there, and you can see the Romans have no chance. None whatsoever. Okay, virtually everybody is killed. All the Romans, with only a few exceptions, are killed. Even the ones who are captured are just slaughtered deliberately. Once Varus realizes how bad it is, he knows what's going to happen if he's captured. And his commanders, some of his highest ranking officers who are with him, understand exactly their own fate. So all of them, Varus starts, and followed by his commanders, they all commit suicide. Now you can go read up, if you want on this, all the details. Let me just show you, for 2,000 years, nobody knew where this happened. That's hard to believe, something on this scale. People tried to, later as the centuries passed, people tried to find the battle site, but this is a heavily forested area, and it was lost, completely lost. As hard as it is to believe, an amateur archaeologist based in Germany in 1987 found the battlefield. He was out there with his little metal detector. Again, you can read all of this. It's fascinating history. He found the battlefield. Here it is today. You can see it's been cleared. If you look there right in the middle, you'll see what looks like a red fencing. That's what the archaeologists have now put up to do their work. And if you look just beyond the red fencing, just behind it, there's a bare spot in the green lawn. That's the current excavations where they're working. You can go there today, just like you can go down to Jamestown and see the archaeologists at work. Well, the same is true in the Teutoburg Forest. Fascinating stuff that we never talk about, never hear about. Okay. Well, why are we talking about this? I'm going to read you a quote. I don't want to keep. I want to give you somebody else's words, an historian who tries to summarize this. The loss, Teutoburg, was just utterly devastating to Augustus. I have picked here, for the purposes of art, one of the masks. This is a Roman mask that was found by the archaeologist at the site of the battle. So this is authentic. This is what one of those Romans would have been wearing. Let me read you the quote. Only a handful of survivors managed to somehow to escape into the forest and make their way to safety. The news they brought home so shocked the Romans that many people ascribed it to supernatural causes, claiming that a statue of the goddess Victory had ominously reversed direction. Now, what's that mean? Well, Augustus had placed a statue of the goddess of Victory in the Roman chamber, the Senate chamber, to kind of emphasize that Victory smiles on us Romans because we're so civilized and our military is so crack. Well, Augustus decided that maybe Victory had turned her back on the Romans. I mean, that was the depth of the despair. Okay, the historian Suetonius, writing a century after the battle, asserted that the defeat, quote, nearly wrecked the empire. According to archaeologist Peter Wells, some of the writers in Rome were baffled by the disaster. The local Germanic societies were much more complex than the Romans thought. They were an informed, dynamic, rapidly changing people who practiced complex farming, fought in organized military units, and communicated with each other across very great distances. Way more sophisticated than the Romans thought. More than 10% of the entire imperial army had been wiped out. The myth of its invincibility shattered. In the wake of the debacle, Roman bases in Germany were hastily abandoned. Augustus, dreading that Arminius would march on Rome, expelled all Germans and all Gauls from the city and put security forces on alert against insurrection. That's how bad this was. And we've never heard about it. Now, well, there's some people who not only heard about it, but never forgot it. And that's why I'm sharing all this. Let me just show you quickly, just so again you have an idea geographically what's happening here. The green, if you see these green places, little enclaves of green, that's how far the Romans had gotten when all this began. They managed to pacify certain areas, and then in these, right up here, they also had some success. But this huge middle ground were the tribes that were hostile. When, following the Battle of Teutoburg Forest, everything east of the Rhine was gone. The Romans had no more claim on it. They tried one more time, we don't have to get into this, they tried one more time later, failed again. So from that point on, Northern Europe and Southern Europe were two separate places, and that's the point of our story. Okay. What we're really talking about then is what I call the long memory, people who don't forget what happened. Here's just an illustration of how those dark forests must have been. Now, this is important to our story. I'm showing you this because darkness is not just something that's literal, it's also something that's psychological. We're trying to understand this map over here. Again, I'm going to read, let somebody else speak. The battle reinforced another effect, not just this, we lost our military. The battle reinforced another effect, one less tangible, but one that has had a profound psychological and social impact on Europe and is still being felt today. It confirmed the fault line between North and South. History could now be used to back up long-held prejudices. The Romans regarded themselves as the superior society to all of these barbarians. This divide has been most archly articulated by a British journalist named A.A. Gill, who said, "The slaughter in Teutoburg Forest divided Europe into two parts. First, the people of the warm South, who forever saw forests as dreadful places to be avoided and cleared, homes to dragons and trolls, antitheses to the civilized city. The other group were people of the North, who understood forests to be healing, protecting, mystical, spiritual places." Now listen to this last line. "How you feel about a silent birch forest at twilight says more about your blood and your kin than about your passport." Whoa. Something to think about, right? Well, that's what's going on here. Not something that happened, but that's something that didn't happen. Rome lost. It lost its claim, and people remembered. Okay. Okay. Now, very quickly, we're going to fast forward in time, 700 years. Here's the empire in green of Charlemagne, the Carolingians. Everything in green is his, but look at that little yellow spot up here. Guess what? That's the land between the Rhine and the Elbe River, the land of Arminius. It's also the land of Luther. And now in this map, by this time it's called Saxony. It was still called Saxony at Luther's time. It had been divided into two Saxonies by the time of Luther. We don't care about that right now. The point is, Charlemagne realized that he really needed to look across the Rhine and do something about all those people over there. Does that sound familiar? And he did. He succeeded. He conquered Saxony. You know who Charlemagne was. And then he had the policy that everybody had to believe the same thing in his empire. He'd already, Gaul, or Franconia, he called it was already Christianized, but these barbarians here were not, so he converted them all. That's how we get Luther's Germany into Christianity. Charlemagne did it. Now, he used a very unconventional method. He baptized everybody first, then he went back home and sent missionaries to tell the people what they believed. You can read that history if you want. I'm giving you a very simple version of a much more complicated series of events. Okay, now fast forward again to the time of Luther, time of the Reformation, late 1400s, early 15, or all of the 1500s really. Guess who suddenly reappears? Arminius. He'd been forgotten, lost, who cares? The site of the battle long since lost. Suddenly Arminius resurfaces. Why? Because somebody finds a manuscript in a monastery which mentions all of this history, and now the German folks, being part of what under Charlemagne became the Holy Roman Empire, are starting to have an identity that they didn't have centuries earlier. And Arminius gives them a way of thinking about that identity. I just used this statue. This again is just an illustration. We don't know what Arminius looks like, but this is just a nice way of kind of thinking about it. You can see in the background the trees of the dark forest, and here is this mighty warrior, this folk hero. Now a folk hero. When he reemerges, he becomes a folk hero of the German people. And, by the way, his name is changed. The Germans changed it to Ehrmann. They don't want Latin. No, you don't want Latin. You want a German name, right, for your hero. So he becomes Ehrmann. We say Hermann in English. Ehrmann. Okay. Now we go to yet another question. Is geography destiny? This is a modern map. You know this. I want to give you two takes on why this is important to the Reformation and to Christianity, the history of Christianity. Had Arminius not frustrated Augustus in his aim to establish a frontier at the Elbe River, the far side of modern Germany, almost the whole of the present Republic of Germany and the Czech area of Czechoslovakia would have been part of the Roman Empire. In the end, these territories would have become as docile and Latinized as Gaul, France. Any idea of the Rhine as a frontier would have been irrelevant and forgotten. The whole concept of Germany would have been unimaginably different, and so therefore would every subsequent century of European history. You've heard the old idea that the horse lost his shoe and then the general lost the battle and he lost the da-da-da-da-da. Is it possible that that much of Western society was turned upside down thanks to Arminius? Another quote, had Rome not been defeated, same idea, almost all of modern Germany, as well as much of the present-day Czech Republic, would have come under Roman rule. All Europe west of the Elbe might well have remained Roman Catholic. Germany would be speaking a Romance language. The 30 Years' War might never have occurred. And the long, bitter conflict between the French and Germans might never have taken place. Is geography destiny? I'm just throwing this on the table for you. Okay, now, this will be of interest to you, to see what a long memory really means. Here we are fast forwarding to the early 1800s. We've come from the early 1500s with Luther at the church door to the early 1800s, 300 years later, with the Battle of Leipzig. This is where the French and the German confronted each other. I'm not a European historian. You may know more about this than I do. The point is that Germany pushed back the French. to the other side of the Rhine. They defeated the French, forcing them back across the Rhine. Again, does that sound familiar? And look what they did. This is an artist's attempt to capture what happened. Look who the artist has picked. Arminius Hermann, the great warrior who has freed Germany from her bondage. Of all the symbols that the artist might have picked, he reached back to 9 AD. Okay, so Arminius has not been forgotten. Now, let's fast forward to later, fast forward to later in the 1800s. In 1871, is it? The country we know as Germany was created. The Holy Roman Empire had dissolved. We now have what we would call modern Germany, the 1870s. One of the ways they celebrated that, look what they did. They built a statue to Hermann. This word simply means a monument to Hermann, the monument of Hermann. And it is impressive. You can go today and see it. You can see they put it on top of a hill, not surprising, top of a mountain really. They made one mistake. They thought they had found the site of the battlefield. So they had Hermann looking over the battlefield. They were wrong by 50 miles. But they couldn't know that in 1875. That's when the statue was dedicated. Okay? Very interestingly, they deliberately made sure that Hermann was facing the Rhine River. That's the line you don't dare cross. Arminius made sure. Okay, I'm going to fast forward now for you because I just want to capture how strong this memory is. We're not going to have time to linger on this because I've got one more thing to tell you that I think you don't know. Here we go. Here's what it looks like today. There's the visitor center. They've really gone all out to make this, keep this memory alive. Here it is, a very impressive statue looking down over all of Germany. Now, there's a little group of Germans who came to America, went to Minnesota. They called their little town New Ulm, U-L-M, New Ulm. And what did they do? They remembered Arminius. He was their hero, so they put up a much smaller version of the same statue. You can go there today, you can walk up the steps, go to the top, look out over this cute little town of New Ulm. It's as German as it's possible to be. And it's right across the street from Martin Luther College, a very conservative Lutheran school, right across the street from this statue. So again, the Germans brought their memory with them to the New World. Likewise, they did it in Missouri. This time they named their town Hermann, or they call it Herman, not Hermann. In Missouri, you can go there today, and look what they did on their main street. Put up a little statue of Herman. Herman the German. Okay. Now this just keeps going. Here is, very quickly, this is the famous flying boat built by Howard Hughes. The nickname, Herman the German, I'm not showing you this because the name was given to the boat, to the aircraft. It was not. The nickname of the aircraft was the Spruce Goose. But the name was given to the crane that's lifting the plane. Why is that? Because the crane was actually built in Germany. And after World War II, the Allies got their hands on it, brought it to the U.S. and put it in service out of Long Beach, California. And that's what it turned out. They used it to lift the airplane out of the water so it could be moved to another location. But they remembered Arminius when they nicknamed the crane. Can you imagine? Lastly, now this really will, I don't know what to say about this. In 2010, I'm not a soccer fan, but if you follow soccer, this was the World Cup. Here, wait a minute, I think it was, let me be sure I'm right about this. No, 2014, I apologize. World Cup soccer, 2014, Brazil versus Germany, and to everybody's utter amazement, Germany won, beat Brazil. Some smart aleck, and I must say, decided to take the statue of Hermann and replace it, or take the statue that's overlooking Rio de Janeiro with the Christ figure and push Christ off the pedestal. You can see Christ falling, and Hermann is the victor. Germany won. Now, is this tasteless? Yes.
Yeah.
So I'm not defending this, but isn't it, it still tells us something how deep these roots run, rightly or wrongly, how deep these roots run. Okay. I call that Herman of the playing field. Okay, now I want to switch to something completely different. Last week, Marilyn asked about Henry VIII. Let's find my, should I get all my good information here? Which I seem to, here it is. The first thing to know about Henry VIII is that he was a contemporary of Martin Luther. Luther was older only by 7 years, and they both died within a year of each other. So these are two parallel figures growing up and claiming their place in history at exactly the same time. So Henry VIII is growing up with the Reformation, just like most of the people associated with the red flags. So this is the world we're talking about when we talk about the Reformation. And Luther, we're really talking about what's going over in the British Isles, particularly in England, because Henry VIII is going to rise to power, and you know what happens next. Henry VIII, again, this is so complicated, we don't have to go into it. Henry VIII was not a theologian, he was a politician, he was a Catholic, and essentially remained a Catholic all his life, particularly toward the end. He would vacillate depending on what was politically expedient. He was not interested, for example, when he got his mistress Anne Boleyn pregnant, he wasn't worrying about theology. He needed an annulment to his marriage. And so, ironically, even though he didn't like Luther, and the two men never met, even though he didn't like Luther and he didn't like kind of the overall nature of what was happening, he needed the Reformation. Why? Because he needed to be his own priest. That's what Luther said. We're all priests. We don't need that intermediary. And of all people who did not need an intermediary, it was Henry VIII. So he needed to become head of his own church so he could annul his marriage. Well, you know that story. Okay. Toward the end of his life, well, first of all, you know why, one reason he's famous.
6 months.
Incredible story, absolutely incredible story. Anne Boleyn is wife number 2. And now, you remember there were 3 children who survived the 6 marriages. They were the first 3 marriages. Catherine of Aragon had Mary. Anne Boleyn has Elizabeth. And Jane Seymour has Edward. Just to refresh your memory real quick. That's the sequence here. I'm bringing all of this up because as we progress through the marriages and we get late in life, by the time he marries wife number 6, Catherine Parr, Henry is in very, very bad health and deteriorating rapidly. He can't even walk anymore. We don't need to get into all of that. But Catherine turns out to be a remarkable woman. And I'm going to suggest to you that she is an unsung hero or heroine of the Reformation. And I say that because I invoke once more the alternative title, Riding the Reformation. We are still riding the Reformation as Protestants in America. How did we get to this point in time? How did the Protestant faith get across the Atlantic and survive? I'm going to suggest, again, this is revisionist history, I'm going to suggest we've got to thank Catherine Parr. And here's why. Here she is. This portrait was taken in, was made in, we think in 1546. Now let me get out. I want to give you good dates. Catherine and Henry marry in 1543. So this is when she was queen. Okay? Now let me tell you a lot about her. She has a very interesting story. I don't know if you can read all of this. I guess you can. First of all, she was one of the more educated of his wives. In fact, she was probably the best educated of his wives. A very intellectual woman who never lost her love of learning all her life. And she ended up, in fact, writing 2 books that were published in England. This is almost unheard of. And those books were sold well. They were more, I'm going to call them inspirational books. I've not attempted to go read any of that material. You can do that. But she was a successful author in her own right. She had been married twice before she married Henry, and twice widowed, and had no children from those marriages when she married Henry in 1543. Now, let me see if I can get this straight. This is very complicated. When Henry and Catherine marry, the child of Henry's first marriage, Mary Tudor, is already grown up. She's now a grown woman, 27 years old. So she's out of the palace. I mean, she has her own life. But there are 2 children still living with Henry when Catherine marries. Elizabeth, who's age 9, I've got that here, and Edward, who is 5. So Elizabeth becomes a stepmother. She's technically a stepmother to Mary, but that's not a practical relationship, given the way the monarchy is structured. But it's very important to remember now what's going to happen. Because you have a 9-year-old child and a 5-year-old child who are now in the palace with some contact, maybe a lot, maybe less, it can change, with the stepmother, Catherine. That relationship is going to remain until Edward, when Henry dies in 1547, Edward becomes king. But he is still a child. So somebody has to be the regent, somebody has to make decisions for him. Catherine, being the stepmother, hoped it would be her. But the way that protocol works, it wasn't her, it turned out to be somebody else. But so she is there with Elizabeth. And you know who Elizabeth is going to turn out to be. And that's what's critical to this whole narrative. Because Catherine is determined to educate her children, whatever that takes, and she's queen, so she's got the resources to do it. Here's what happens. Again, you can play this same game, trying to imagine. But she hires reform. She is open to the Reformation. Catherine is open to the Reformation. She gets becomes very sympathetic, studies it, reads her Bible, etc. Despite the fact that Henry is going back to his Catholicism. And this relationship gets very, very dangerous for Catherine. She came this close to losing her head. You can read this story yourself. I'm going to spare all those dramatics for you today. Elizabeth and Catherine then spend about 5 years together from Elizabeth ages 9 to 14. I'm going to suggest to you that this is when Elizabeth becomes permanently Protestant. Those were the formative years. And you know what then happens when Elizabeth becomes queen. She follows Bloody Mary, who had taken England back to Catholicism. Elizabeth reverses that back to Church of England, and it's never become Catholic again. So when it crossed the ocean, not with Elizabeth, but with her successor, James I, you know Virginia, you know James River, Church of England came with him. And are we today Protestant because of Elizabeth? Well, yeah. But why was Elizabeth Protestant? I'm going to suggest it was because of Catherine Parr. And I invite you to pursue that, not me telling you, but just letting me throw that out for you. A sign of the Reformation that you would never think about. Somebody we owe, and praise the Lord, thank you, Lord, for Catherine Parr. And Henry dies when she's still alive. Okay, thank you so much. Any questions? Yes, sir.
Arminius and Armenia, are they related at all?
Oh, not that I know.
May I ask, the picture you showed us of Brazil, where
Yes.
price figure was, that is a picture, isn't it? I mean,
No.
they didn't really do
It's
that.
doctored.
Photoshop.
No, they didn't really do that.
Oh,
Artist.
I thought I saw it, but,
It
yeah,
was a doctored picture.
okay.